Good morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and welcome to another bookish breakfast. So this week I have not been reading an awful lot once again due to having lots of shifts in a short amount of time, but in the gaps between my shifts I have been learning a little bit of history, and I've been learning mainly about the British Empire. It's been somehow an oddly empire themed week for me, and that's partially because of a couple of things I've chosen to look into to kind of expand my historical knowledge. So it's been talked about a lot over the years, and in particular recently, how the British education system is not necessarily very good at teaching us about the history of things that Britain did in the world. And yes, sometimes it's useful to know what's happened in the past. So I never studied history in terms of at university. I did do history at college, so that's when I was like 16, 17, and I did a history GCSE. Those history courses focused heavily on the First and Second World War. And my college history course was a little bit better. It was for the International Baccalaureate, and it had a little bit of a more of a global focus. So we looked at the conflict around Israel-Palestine, but we looked at it entirely as a historical phenomenon. So I think we pretty much said that it ended in like 1983, which is hilariously inaccurate in a slightly depressing way. And what else did we look at? We did like a historical project where we could pick anything in the world. So I looked at some of the history of conflict in Peru, because that was something that I was interested in at the time. So yeah, not particularly relevant to the British Empire. I would say my knowledge about empire is probably above average based on somebody of my age, because a lot of people just simply aren't interested at all in history, whereas I read books, I am interested in hearing different points of view and voices and so on, but yeah, it's definitely not very good. Where we talked about English history before GCSEs in school, like I remember talking about the slave trade, but talking about the abolition of the slave trade and how brilliant the British were at abolishing the slave trade. And like we talked about how the British saw off the Spanish Armada, but didn't really talk about the wider conflict that was going on between imperial powers around the time of the Spanish Armada that led to this being a thing, really. So yeah, it was a very limited view of history. Although, I've always loved my history lessons, and I've always, really loved my history teachers as well. But yeah, there was definitely maybe a lack of breadth there. And just obviously in light of the things that have been happening in the past month or so regarding sort of Black Lives Matter protests and so on, there have been more resources kind of thrown around that I have decided to kind of latch onto slightly and focused on the empire side of learning, because I think it's something that still very much has a legacy and very much influences Britain today in terms of population and where people come from when they choose when somebody who's deciding to move countries, what country they decide to move to, in terms of people who want to come to Britain, because there is a legacy there where they might speak English, or they might have contacts already in Britain because of the legacy of empire. And also a legacy in terms of how British people, unfortunately, think about themselves, where there is a large group of people who seem to still think that the empire almost exists and it is something that we can somehow depend upon and flourish because of, when actually that's not very accurate. Yes, but now is not the time to get upset about Brexit. So yeah, what have I been doing? I suppose some of this started from reading Around the World in 80 Trains. So she's Monisha Rajesh, at the point where I'm reading, she's in Asia. And she's travelling through a variety of countries that were either directly colonialised, occupied by colonial forces, I suppose, or became colonies. That's probably the better way of putting it. Or were their policies and the way that they were set up as a state was directly influenced by the colonisation that was going on around them, and particularly travelling on the trains, like. In theory, the trains are one of the amazing things that the British did for the countries that they colonised. Like we built loads of trains, yay! So it's not exactly something that she directly talks about, but it's definitely something that there is almost reference to in the background. And yeah, I'm enjoying this. I think it's getting better as time goes on. She's kind of like getting a little bit deeper into it. So yeah, talking about more kind of specific events, including she's started to focus on events in the area around the time of the Second World War, which I'm enjoying. So that is one aspect. But the majority is like a not book-based learning, I suppose. So Audible was recommending some books and podcasts and things that were relevant at the moment. So I listened to We Need to Talk About the British Empire by Afua Hirsch, and that's a quite short 6-episode podcast. I never really listen to podcasts because I'm not really, like, when I'm doing things at the point where somebody else might be listening to podcasts, I'm normally listening to BookTube, like when I'm doing the washing up or that kind of thing, like general household chores, or I'm listening to, if I'm able to focus for longer, I'm listening to an audiobook normally. But yeah, I decided to give this one a try. I just finished night shifts and I kind of didn't really want to sleep, so I kind of just lay there and listened to the whole of the podcast, and it was quite emotionally impactful. So there's some reviews of this podcast that say that it's very one-sided and very critical of the British Empire, but it's very one-sided, you could argue, but from the side that we never really hear that much about, or we've only started to hear that much about in recent years. So I think it's a very, very valuable approach to take, to focus on the less examined aspects of the British Empire. And what Afua Hirsch does is she talks, in each individual podcast, she talks to one individual who might be a writer or an actor or just somebody recognisable. For instance, she talks to Benjamin Zephaniah in one episode, or just like generally people with stories who are good at talking about their stories, I suppose. And she talks about their family history within the British Empire. So there's a slight focus on the later years of the British Empire that's still maybe within living memory or within memory of somebody's, like somebody could say, my granddad did this, or this happened within my family. And I found that really interesting because it's a very personal take on history that we sometimes miss, and sometimes we have to like take a bigger picture and we miss the kind of like the little details. I would say personally to me this wasn't very one-sided because she did mix up the people that she spoke to. For instance, she spoke to Dame Diana Rigg, whose father, I believe, was a working class British man who went to India, and that for him was an incredible opportunity that enabled him to, prosper in a way that he never would have been able to in the United Kingdom. So I think like looking at that kind of how that side of how like class within Britain played into things, I found that quite interesting. And Dame Diana Rigg's memories of empire, even though she's kind of acknowledges that there were problems, are quite rose-tinted because it was a wonderful place that she grew up in her early childhood to her. So yeah, I felt like there were other sides to it. She also spoke to, I stupidly didn't write this name down, but a young woman who is from British Hong Kong, if that makes, she's British, but she's also from Hong Kong. British Chinese doesn't seem quite right, but I think that's a term that she discusses in the podcast, and talks about the end of the British rule there in 1997, and reflects on the fact that actually, like she thinks for Hong Kong it was better to be under the British than it would have been to maybe be under China for that period of things like the Cultural Revolution and so on. So I found that there was nuance there, and there were other voices explored, but there were also facts explored that we don't tend to talk about almost at all, like just talking about like the networks of the slave trade a little bit more, and how heavily it was influenced by things like nepotism, and just a really unpleasant capitalistic arrangement. So yeah, I found that a fascinating podcast, and I could talk about it for ages, but it's better that you just go and listen to it because it's not too long, probably maybe about 4.5 or 5 hours in total. Then the other thing that I've been doing, slightly less good, but more interactive, is a Futurelearn course called Empire, the Controversies of British Imperialism, and that is run by the University of Exeter. So the issues of this course are, it's it's beginner's level, so it's targeted at anybody with any level of knowledge, which is good for me because like I said, I don't really have any kind of level of knowledge. But it says that it's talking about controversies, and so far I'm on week 3, and I think it is going at it from the perspective of maybe 10 years ago, where the things weren't so much discussed. And to be fair, I think the course was first run in 2015, so things have probably moved on since then. But it still talks in a way that, to me, is quite old-fashioned. For instance, they're talking about violence in colonial regimes and the use of air policing, which was essentially bombing of civilians to suppress unrest. And the guy who's doing the mini lecture says, historians mostly agree that air policing in Iraq was a success. And I really don't think that that's a term that you should be using in that way. So you could say air policing in Iraq was effective at suppressing unrest, but to say people at the time viewed it as a success, that's valid, because they probably did, because it completed their purposes. But I feel like if we're talking about violence, and how violence was used by colonial powers, to say that it was simply a success doesn't really go into enough of how many civilians might have died, or how the legacy of that might be continuing to have an impact. So I felt like, because it's such a beginner's level course, and because they're trying to kind of summarise a few key themes, there was a lack of depth, and that lack of depth often resulted in an analysis that kind of seemed to favour the British, even though it was allegedly kind of opening up the discussion a little bit more. But yeah, I guess I don't know very much about historical study in this area, and probably what I have learned has tended to be, aside from at school, what have learned in recent years has probably tended to be more on the anti-imperialism side, if that makes sense. So if I have a one-sided form of learning, it's maybe the reverse of the traditional one-sided learning. I don't know. So yeah, I was less impressed by that course. I'm going to finish it. It's 6 weeks long, and it's like 3 hours a week, and it's free to join, so if anybody wants to join it, I'll try and put a link in the description. Yeah, so yeah, lost my train of thought there. It's good, but I have sort of mixed views on it, and I feel like if they're running a course now, like Futurelearn has the capacity that you can upload a new video, or you can upload a end of week discussion video, or you can link to a discussion video that you put on YouTube. So if the discussion has moved on since 2015, the course directors have the capacity to address that, but I suppose they've moved on to other things now, because it was 5 years ago. The discussions in the comments have also been interesting, because there's a whole range of people there, and there's a whole range of people who are highly critical of the course, and maybe more vocal, even far more vocal than I am, in terms of thinking that the course is limited. But there are others who are quite pro-empire, I would say, or people just talking about the fact that they grew up in the 1950s, where the British Empire was just seen as naturally a good thing in terms of where they were educated. So it's been interesting to read the discussions as well. So the other thing I will try and talk about relatively briefly, because I talked for longer already than I intended to, was last night I watched the National Theatre at Home for this week, last week now, which was the play Small Island, which was based on a book by Andrea Levy. And if for whatever reason you have 3 hours in your day today that it's not accounted for, I would highly recommend that you watch that. It will be available until 8 p.m. tonight, where it will be replaced by A Midsummer Night's Dream. So Small Island is the story of a person or a group of people who moved from Jamaica to the United Kingdom in the aftermath of the Second World War. So it's one of the characters does actually travel on the Windrush, so it's a kind of Windrush generation of people moving to the UK for supposedly a better life. And she says, when I'm in the UK, I will have a front door with a bell that goes ding-a-ling, and I will be able to ring the bell, and just like the impression of it's going to be wonderful. And then the play kind of explores how when they arrive, that's gradually torn apart and then reconfigured as they realise that they're not going to be able to just go and study the law, or they're not going to be able to just go and become a teacher, because people keep asking them when they're going to learn English when they've been speaking English all their lives, and like little things like that. And it's a really funny play, but it was also very emotional and a very good discussion of sort of social issues. So I would recommend that if you get the chance, or if you have seen it, let me know what you thought about it. And yeah, it looks at, I suppose it's quite good in the way that there are characters that come across as overall good characters on the British side, maybe mixed characters who are also incredibly, overwhelmingly racist due to, I suppose, the newness of suddenly having a large group of people, I don't know, like, just examining the way that the abruptness of the change maybe pushed people to be more unpleasant than they otherwise maybe seem to be, and I guess like thinking about how do you change people's opinions, or how do you get people to accept social change at that time, which obviously didn't really happen very well, unfortunately. So yeah, that's been my week. Learning a little bit more about the British Empire, particularly like things like the partition of India I knew next to nothing about, but now I know a lot more. So I feel like I'm getting there and I'm learning. And I was talking to one of my colleagues actually whose family originates from one of the areas that was disputed in the partition, and she was talking about how it remains a difficult area for her family to be able to visit and things like that. So yeah, it's been interesting. It's been a good week. And let me know what you've been reading and how you're doing, and happy reading, and take care. Thank you for watching.